Hi, good morning. Thank you for joining me on this seminar about young people's wellbeing here on the very first morning of Fresh Streams 2021. I'm really glad that you can join me. My name is Nate and I lead a ministry called Talk Through that seeks to equip the church to be the help young people need. I spent 27 years working in youth working in the wellbeing world. I'm the founder of a mental health charity, qualified as a counsellor and worked in 3 secondary schools as a school counsellor for many years. I've been one of the pastors at Gorsey Baptist Church for 10 years and now devote my time, as I say, to leading Talk Through and equipping others to be the help that young people need. So I'm really glad that you've joined me to talk about a subject that I'm really passionate about, and that is young people's well-being. You don't have to, do you, spend too long watching the news or reading a social media feed before you will stumble across some story that talks or reports about a deterioration in young people's mental health and well-being. You know, young people in the United Kingdom consistently score low in happiness leagues in countries across the world. In fact, young people in the UK are some of the unhappiest in the world. Now, we need to be honest, there are many young people who are doing really well, but there are others who are not. And one thing is for sure, many of us in our lifetime will experience some deterioration or a period of our lives when we struggle with poor mental health. Now, we have to be realistic. In our session this morning, we're not going to cover all the do's and don'ts and symptoms and causes and what to look out for. So what I want to do instead is take a slightly different trajectory than normal. And that's explore what are some of the ancient paths we find in the Bible that might help us in our ministry in terms of supporting young people's mental health and well-being. The first ancient path that I think we find in the Bible is the ancient path that simply meanders its way through our life of God being present with us through all seasons. In other words, God is present with us in our troubles, and following God and being a Christian, troubles come our way too. The two run together. You know, one of the great challenges of mental health is accepting that we're struggling and knowing in essence that it's okay. We need to help young people know that God cares about our well-being, that struggling is part of life, and importantly, we don't need to hide the struggle. You'd think, wouldn't you, in an age where we talk about mental health and well-being so much, famous people raise up their own stories, we see it in the news, that everybody would be okay about talking about it. And we might be on a sort of surface factual level, but when it often comes to our own story, it's a different picture. You see, we're very good at destigmatizing struggles for others, but when it's our own life, it's so much harder. Our brains, you see, fire all sorts of messages, don't they? And narratives our way. You know, I shouldn't be feeling this way. What's wrong with me? People won't understand. I'm weak. What will people think of me? They'll think I'm silly. I could be letting people down. People have it worse than I do. I shouldn't be worrying. I should be strong, etc., etc. And it's very easy to also pick up negative messages about well-being, and so we don't feel safe enough to talk. And at other times we might not even understand why we're low or the crisis situation we are in, by its very nature makes it very difficult to seek help or find help. And we all go through experiences like major bereavements and friendship breakdowns, and stuff can happen to us, and all of that can overwhelm us. Sometimes it's difficult to handle our own well-being. But it's vital in all of that that we really focus on destigmatizing poor mental health and life struggles. In other words, we are very good at promoting to young people routes to success, doing well academically, achieving, and we can do the same with faith, you know, be on fire for God, etc., etc. And there's nothing wrong with encouraging and inspiring young people to do well and live for God and do well in life, but we must do so that passion, those drivers as it were, live and amongst the struggles of life too, and the reality of life's challenges, not in opposition to them. When you look at the Bible, for me, it's fundamentally a book about well-being. In Genesis chapter 2, or 1 and 2, God creates the heavens and the earth, and all is well. And then in Revelation 21, he makes everything well. And what we see is that God, in between that time, every hour that has passed, is a narrative of the God who draws us and has a desire for wellness, physical, emotional, spiritual, and eternal. But it's not that thing sits opposite to us, is that heart lives itself out amidst the life that we're in. Wonderfully, what I notice about this story is that God seems unafraid to meet us where we are. Often we talk about following God to young people, and they can easily think the following God path is over here and the day-to-day normal life is here. But actually what we see is that God has laid an ancient path that we can walk all our life through, with him next to us through all human experiences. The very first thing that Adam and Eve do in the Garden of Eden when they fail is they hide. And the very first thing that God does is he steps in and then he calls them out. You see, for me, this sets a very, very powerful image of the God who then constantly keeps pursuing us despite our brokenness in everyday life. What I see unfolding in the Bible is a God who constantly draws near to pain in the painful times, to the poor, the hurting, the lonely, the troubled, the broken, those in darkness. God clearly responds to human brokenness with compassion and love and desires to bring us to healing and hope. Tough times are part of the human experience. And it's from knowing that we really need to help young people understand that, reminding them it's okay to not be okay, and to remind ourselves that it's okay to not be okay. And rather than the need to hide and be embarrassed and feel shame, that actually we need to create safe spaces, places where young people can come and discover God's love for them, and we can journey with them. There's an ancient path in the Bible, in other words, of God dwelling amongst us, working amongst us on the path of everyday life. And once people know that they don't have to be superhuman, that it's okay to struggle, and that that's part of life, it enables us to create safe spaces, non-judgmental spaces, listening spaces, and room for whatever season a young person finds themselves in. We're not calling young people to live our walk. We're calling them to develop their walk with God. The enemy wants to keep us hiding because it's in that place we're left reeling and confused and stressed. But by calling people out from hiding, as it were, we can call them into a place where they can discover the next important path I think we find in the Bible. And it's the path of connecting, of community, and of counsel. As we come out of hiding, we do so to conversation. We see that in Genesis chapter 2. And this is where we can discover this importance of talking. Now, clearly as believers, we believe in that ancient path of prayer. But have you ever noticed when you're struggling how sometimes prayer can be pretty challenging? One of my favourite stories in the Bible is 2 Chronicles chapter 20, when King Jehoshaphat is faced with this vast army. And it says in verse 3, alarmed, I like that, shows you that it's okay to panic sometimes. He resolved to inquire of the Lord. That's critical. He resolved to realise, I can't do this on my own. But what you also notice is that he didn't just pray on his own. He says he gathered all the people together to seek God. One of the challenges that we can face when we're struggling is that we can try to cope with our problems on our own. Now, our minds are not always the most, objective, don't always have the best perspective. We're not always good at recognising truth and not always good at self-care and positivity. In Proverbs chapter 3, we're reminded to trust in the Lord with all our hearts and not lean on our understanding. Our minds can be formidable places. And trying to figure out life on our own, in our own headspace, I don't think is always a good idea. You see, I think throughout the Bible, we see God pave out community. We see God show us how by talking to others, being part of a community together, that we can seek counsel and guidance and instruction and, in a sense, the right way to live. We can get support. People need support to make sense of what they're going through, and God has provided that through community. As I said earlier on, the enemy seeks to isolate, confuse and blame. God seeks to embrace and bring meaning and put an end to condemnation. By talking with others, we can help people talk and help young people discover that ancient path of seeking counsel. And I think it's found throughout the Bible. Jesus constantly spends his life talking to people and helping them to make sense of life. If you think about it, if we could get people to come out of hiding, knowing that they'll find acceptance, that they don't need to feel shame, and then give them access to somebody who can help them and draw alongside them and help them to talk, we will go a long way to helping young people find solutions to many of their well-being issues. In fact, it's often what youth work is so good at. And in today's world, that might also mean that we signpost young people to the Council of Counsellors and GPs and mental health specialists or specialist charities. And also that we too might seek counsel about the work we're doing to make sure that we're working within our sort of capabilities and in the right way with young people and in our limitations. But I do believe that there's an ancient path of community and connecting to community that we need to help people discover and be part of. But then there is another path, and that is the path or the paths of helping young people to learn to live life well. And many years ago, I read a book by Selwyn Hughes called The 7 Laws of Spiritual Success. And to sort of summarise the introduction, he talks about how one day he had dinner with a scientist who was talking about natural law in the universe. And he just said, there's natural laws that a scientist see running throughout the whole of the universe. He said, do you think there are laws that run through spirituality, almost like spiritual laws, that sort of hold faith together, that keep us connected in the right way? And it set Selwyn Hughes on a journey where he began to think to himself, all these years I've followed God. What has God taught me? What has he shown me? And he writes the book, The 7 Laws of Spiritual Success. But that story has always resonated with me. And right at this moment, I'm writing a brand new resource for a charity for youth workers and churches to take into schools around young people's well-being. But it's all based on this idea of learning to live life well. Martin Seligman, who's one of the theorists around positive psychology, says this: it is my view that therapy is usually too late, and that by acting when the individual was still doing well, preventative interventions would save an ocean of tears. I believe the Bible reveals paths in which we can find wholeness. In our Zoom session this afternoon, we're going to explore these ideas a little bit more. But I think what I'm trying to draw us to is that young people and all of us are seeking to be content, to be happy. And the routes that our society offers just simply don't take us there. But there is evidence-based research from psychology across the world that you and I see rooted in the Bible that can really help people to live well. It can include things like savouring and taking time to be slow and appreciate being in the moment and recalling good things to mind. It can be about kindness, thankfulness, forgiveness, how to have healthy relationships, how to look after our minds and our bodies and our souls, discovering our purpose and living for something bigger than ourselves. All these things are proven when established in our lives to help us to find fulfillment and well-being. You see, God, the Word of God reveals to us what a life lived well can look like, how living well can bring us benefits. And when Jesus came, I think he came to tell us, I've come to give you life in all its fullness, John 10:10, that he's trying to say to us, you haven't quite got it as full as it should be. And I want to stress here, I don't believe that the work of Christ is just some ticket for the soul to get to heaven. I believe that he came to bring about the kingdom, and the kingdom as it is manifested now, the kingdom that's both now and not yet, but this kingdom is about bringing us transformation today. My old pastor used to say this, he said, life isn't something you get, because you die or when you die. It's something you get because Jesus died. I love that. We cannot afford any longer to just keep living life as though it's like one hospital that constantly keeps dealing with the injured when it comes to young people's mental health. We need to help young people to live well. The Bible is littered with ancient paths of good living, of what it means to live a life that flourishes. And that doesn't mean that therefore life is always going to be easy or that life will be pain-free, but actually enables us to build resilience and seek well-being in the right places. I recently read an article about a walking association asking its members to help them rediscover lost rights of way, walking paths. We too are like spiritual ramblers that need to rescue the knowledge of the ancient paths of well-being in the Bible, those paths that lead to a good life, and we need to help young people rediscover them, help them to step on them and clear off the dust and the dirt and the brambles and rediscover living well. I want to finish with this. I struggled with my mental health at different periods of my life, But a few years ago, I was in a very dark place. I'd been signed off ministry for about 6 months. And the Lord said to me one morning, I want you to go to the place where I normally go, which is my prayer walks, where I just spend time out with the Lord. And I'd been off work, as I said, for quite a while, and it was Christmas morning, 2015. And as I stepped onto this little footbridge that crosses over the River Wye, I felt the Lord say to me, can you remember 7 years of plenty for 7 years of famine? 7 years of plenty for 7 years of famine. It was like the Lord was telling me that despite the darkness and difficulty I was in now, what I had invested before in my life, the path that I'd learnt to walk, would help see me through this famine that I was in at this time. What I guess I'm trying to say is I firmly believe that the season we are in now is influenced by the seasons that we've been in before. We need to be able, don't we, to be able to recall what we know about God to help us to get us through the tough times in life. Therefore, let's help young people now discover what it means to come out of hiding. Make it normal now, so when they become unwell, it's normal. Let's help them to find safety now. Let's create conversation and community and counsel now. And let's help young people to walk a life that flourishes all the way to Revelation 21, where the Bible tells us there be no more tears, for the older order of things has passed away. That's an ancient path that I'm willing to walk, and it's an ancient path that I'm willing to help other people to walk. So join us later on this afternoon as we practically explore a little bit more about what that means, and I'll share with you some helpful resources and sources of help that you may find useful in your walk and in your work with young people. And also time for us to have conversation and practical questions as we help young people to rediscover the ancient paths of well-being that are found in the Bible. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. God bless you. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Only a few of us, but it's good to see you. And I guess because most of you have watched the clip, there's not really much more I'll say about it other than what motivated me quickly to maybe take the angle that I took. I spent 27 years working in the wellbeing world with young people. I've been a counsellor of young people for many years. But I think one of the things I've become more and more interested in is how we can prevent poor mental health in the first place. I know we can never completely stop it because some of our poor mental health is not necessarily about anything we've done. It's stuff that happens to us, like a bereavement or being in a stressful situation. But I'm really interested in this idea of, in the same way there's stuff we can do to improve our well-being, there must be stuff we do that's detrimental to our well-being. And I'm really interested in looking at how do we develop habits in our lives, particularly help young people to develop habits. So in essence, they don't become unwell in the first place as easily, maybe. So it's just this idea of, I guess, taking a bit of personal responsibility, which is quite challenging because you don't want people to feel guilty or to hold a burden for feeling unwell. Does that make sense? You don't want people to think, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. It's okay to not be okay. But in all of that, how do we help young people to really find pathways that lead to flourishing? And so that was the motivation of the seminar, really, and just starting with this idea, as you found out, that well-being is in the Bible and God is interested in well-being. And one of the things that when we're not well that can happen to us is that we hide, which is what we see in the Genesis narrative. I know that's in relation to them falling, but I think the same principle applies when sometimes we're not doing very well or we're struggling with life. We hide because of all sorts of issues, shame and guilt and a sense of failure maybe, or whatever it might be. And so I love this narrative of God stepping in and calling us out of hiding. And then from then we follow this journey, don't we, through the Bible, of God constantly drawing near to us and how God is present in all our emotions and situations in life. And so that, for me, is almost the very first ancient path we discover, the Word becoming flesh and dwelling amongst us and journeying with us. And then obviously in this session, I want to maybe unpack some of those things a bit more with you as we discuss together, but also what other paths of well-being are there that maybe we should be encouraging young people to explore. I was sharing with Anna, our host, when we were discussing this seminar last week. There's a theorist called Martin Seligman who works in positive psychology, and he teaches, if we can teach young people optimism in their junior years, they're much less likely to suffer from depression in their adolescence. So there's a lot we can be doing to supporting young people, finding new paths for them to walk on so they don't become unwell. And that's really the beginning of that seminar and I think what we were aiming towards. So I don't know whether that's enough of a start of an introduction, but since you've all seen it, it seems crazy to go into too much detail again.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much, Nate. Like I said before, I guess the point of this time is to kind of practically think about how we work some of those things that Nate has already shared with us, how we work those out practically with our young people. I'm not sure what contexts people are in, whether you're working with young people or a bit of a mix or whatever. You can maybe share that if you'd like to, but yeah, this time is to have a more of a conversation about getting deeper into those wellbeing paths. So we just wanted to create space for questions now. If people have any questions off the back of what Nate's already said in his video, or the little update that you've just shared now. But does anyone have any questions? I know I have a couple, but I will save them for. Has anybody else got any questions?
I don't know if this is a question. Well, it is. That's a good way to preface it. And maybe this is the wrong ballpark, but words. What you just said is great, and I can imagine using that framework for working with children in church and also non-church young people. But how would you, whereas we can with young people who are from church, we can very openly, effectively say go through what you've just said. But how would you recommend maybe using that framework, but for young people who aren't of faith at this point? Does that make sense?
No, that's a really good question. And in fact, actually, maybe we will come into a lot more detail about some of those aspects of wellbeing paths and how we teach them later on. But I think there are 3 stages which we're going to explore today. Is that whole process of destigmatization, and how we get young people out of hiding really is one process. And then the next is how we get them into conversation. Fundamentally, if we could get young people out of hiding, if I can use that phrase, bearing in mind they're still entitled to have a private life, they're still entitled to be able to choose who they share their stories with and don't. But if we can create safe spaces and get them into conversation, we are well on the way to supporting young people's well-being. Even if from our perspective, we reach our limit, of our skill, at least we can then refer them on and help them in that process. So I'm a firm believer in that whole getting them out of hiding into conversation. And it'd be good to explore, I think Anna and I are going to explore how we do those 2 steps. And then the third is, how we take them through that other process of helping them to live well. And I think you're right, outside of a framework, that's quite difficult. But I think there are opportunities, both formally and informally, both within sort of study groups in churches, as well as youth clubs settings, but also maybe potentially in chaplaincy and pastoral work in schools. And at particularly secondary level, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So it hasn't quite answered your question, but it's given you the framework of the question you're asking is actually hopefully where we'll journey.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
That's really good. Thank you.
So I guess, Nate, just to kind of start, I'm really interested in what you've said about helping young people come out of hiding. So what would you say are some of the ways that we can help young people do that, and I guess create those safe spaces to kind of call young people out, draw them out of that hiding, shameful space?
Yeah, you'd think, wouldn't you, with the amount of conversation that's held about well-being, everybody would be really keen to talk about it. And I often say to people, we're often really good, aren't we, at destigmatizing well-being for others. But when it's our own well-being, it's a lot harder because it's so much more real, isn't it? And I think one of the key elements is to do what I've already mentioned, is to start the process of destigmatization and helping young people to understand that it really is okay to not be okay, and that life is full of difficulties and sadness, as well as joys and happiness. And that process needs to be ongoing because, a lot of young people go through experiences that are firsts for them. If that sort of makes sense. They might not be aware that that would normally happen. So it could be their first time that they go through suffering from anxiety or low mood or some other issue. And so it's really important, I think, that we constantly work on destigmatizing mental health and well-being and helping young people to know that that's quite normal. When you're struggling with your poor mental health or any challenge in life, one of the challenges is it goes round and round in your head. We've all had those times, haven't we, when something's happened to us and we're still awake or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And so it's really important to help young people know a little bit about what's happening to them, why it's happening, that that's quite normal. So it's sort of bringing it into the realm of normality rather than young people thinking, I'm odd, I'm strange, I shouldn't be feeling this way. And so I think that basic process of destigmatizing is really important. And I think we do it through conversation and having conversations through well-being. But I think we also need to think around the sorts of messages we communicate. That can be quite helpful. So for instance, I know this is a complex one because in the church, we're a value-based organization, aren't we? We believe in values. But the values we express can sometimes impact how young people feel safe to come. A really easy one to talk about, because it's sort of, there's a lot of clarity around it in one way, is the whole issue of sexuality, for instance. So, you know, they need to know that it's safe to talk about that, but they may well pick up all sorts of messages from us about certain issues. And so it's how we create a place where young people know I can feel safe to talk about this. But I think the basic process is start having conversations about mental health, start having conversations just about life in general and struggling, which of course youth workers actually do all the time, but it's critical to name it. So we can't, with young people, I don't think we should work in the idea of subtlety. I think it's far better to be clear, name it, say it for what it is. And even just doing a basic session plan, exploring what are the issues that their peers and them are facing at the moment. You know, what are the toughest ones to face? What do they do when they've got them? Who do they talk to? Why do they talk to some people and not others? And that conversation can be really helpful just to let young people know that it's okay to talk. So I think understanding values, creating safe places, allowing them to know, you know, that you're there for them and what might happen if you do talk to them. Because young people may, well, all of us do, build a narrative. If I go and talk to Anna, this could happen, that could happen. It's quite important to help them understand as well, you know, that you're a safe place to go to.
That's great. I'm just wondering, Nate, like if we were to, I know that there's a few different contexts that we might kind of start having these conversations in, but what would you kind of say you found are the most helpful questions to ask or conversation starters to get the ball rolling on some of these more deeper conversations, like if we haven't had them before?
Yeah, so I mean, it is difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think a lot when we build, one of the great things I love about youth work is the fact it's relational. And so the very process of that relational work creates the framework to talk. It might be helpful if I share this slide we talked about earlier, and I'm going to bring it up and hopefully you can all see that okay. It's a talking risk model, and it's useful to know about, because when we work with young people, I think sometimes we can forget that, because we know that hopefully we know that we're a safe space and that we're easy to talk to. But this is just an interesting model, because we all find ritual and cliche easy to talk about, you know, what's the weather or sport or a bit of music or whatever the topic is. When we start moving up the pyramid, there is a greater level of risk. So even talking about facts and information can be challenging. You know, how many students will sit in a classroom, they'll know the answer, but they won't put their hand up to give it because they're worried that they might be wrong or they might be embarrassed or so on. And then there's thoughts and judgments, what you think and feel about a topic. Or what you're thinking and feeling about something. So the risk there is higher. So you get the idea. Feelings and emotions, that's quite a risky thing to talk about. And peak experiences would be described as maybe some of the traumas or the really painful stories we go through, things that happen in our lives. And why I find that a really useful model is the who line you see there going up the side. Of course, that will depend on who you're talking to, and obviously what you're talking about, but the what is covered by the pyramid itself. And it's quite useful just to bear that in mind. But one of the key elements, I think, about working with young people's well-being, and what I love about what God does in the Garden of Eden, is how he steps into a situation. And I don't think we should be afraid to step into situations. So if you've ever done mental health first aid, for instance, one of their primary things they train you is something called make the approach. And I think that's the key thing. If we've built positive relationships and we've talked about mental health, we should be the ones who make the approach, whether that just be talking generically or drawing alongside a young person who is not doing so great, or we don't think is doing too great. I came across an organisation in London last year who've got a great thing they do in their youth club. They have little cards, like business cards, and you can write your name on it and you can drop it into a box at the entrance of the youth club, which is I need to talk to someone tonight box. And the youth worker opens it up partway through the evening, and it's got the young person's name on it, and they can go and approach them. And I thought that was a really clever way, because even though that's the young person making the approach, you've made the approach by making it available. And I thought that was a really a good thing to do. But of course, it's worth thinking out, what are the barriers to young people's conversations? I mean, maybe we could have a discussion, but what barriers do you think people face in talking? Why might they not feel comfortable to talk to us? Anybody got any thoughts?
I think my young people just maybe feeling ashamed, depending on what the thing is that they feel they need to talk about, or not knowing the right person to talk to, who's the safest person.
Yeah, I think that's, we're back to the embarrassment and shame issue, and I think that is really powerful. And I think also there's another narrative happening for Christian young people, I almost call spiritual well-being, where they carry guilt and shame around, maybe they feel like they're failing, or they've messed up, or they're not reaching the standard. Because in faith we have a standard, don't we? We might not like to call it that, but it's called holiness. I mean, so we can't run away from it, really. But of course, for some young people, that can be really challenging, particularly if they've struggled, they really think they failed in something. And so they could be feeling, like they've let us down. So you're right there. I think that sense of guilt and shame, it's a hard thing to overcome, other than normalizing it. So I'm not suggesting that we normalize sin to the point where it doesn't matter. That's not what I mean. But I think normalizing is really, really important. I don't know how many of you have had a time when you've struggled with something, you've shared it, and loads of other people have said, me too. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, thank goodness, I'm not the only one. And in therapy, naming something is really powerful. So God said in the Garden of Eden, where are you? They knew they were hiding, so he names it. Where are you? It's a very clever thing that he does. And I think it's okay to name things. That's the key element of thinking destigmatizing. And that starts the conversation. I don't know if anybody else has got anything else they think might be a barrier.
Lack of relationship, I think, is probably a barrier, which is interesting. So when I first moved to this church back in 2018, there's one particular young person who, for some reason, she just felt able to communicate with me. When things, there was very often nights where she would, she'd be sort of hiding in different rooms and crying, all that sort of stuff, and and we sort of built up a good relationship, even just through those Friday nights. But she had a friend who was going through some stuff, and I gathered that from communication with the whole friendship group. But this other girl was very resigned and not wanting to talk, and it's and I guess for some young people, developing a relationship with leaders is a bit harder for whatever reason, and especially if there's not been a youth worker in the church for a few years, they won't know what to do with a youth worker. In effect, they don't know what they're there for, and so I think sometimes the lack of knowing how to approach, or like Anna said, the safety of someone, how that can often be a barrier.
Yeah, and how we create safe spaces is multi-level, isn't it? So there's almost, how do we create it safe so young people can come to us? how do we create it safe so we can go to them? Because it's both, isn't it? Because sometimes young people will just come to us because we'll be none the wiser that there's anything going on. And so you've got to create that avenue. But also there's an issue about place and space, isn't there? You know, for some young people, I used to find talking in a noisy youth club worked because there was over a game of pool or whatever, because there was so much noise going on. They were quite happy to have that conversation, you know, or to have the conversation to the side of you. So they weren't actually looking you face to face. I mean, you know, this is all good youth work practice, isn't it? We know that. But other times we know we need to carve out space. And I mean, a lot of churches offer youth mentoring programs, one-on-one. I think that's quite clever because it allows the space for that conversation to happen. And also it helps deal with sometimes oh, I've got to go and talk to my youth worker about something, or the parents, why are you talking to my young person? It's because it's just part of a natural routine. But you're right about that does become more challenging with young people right on the fringes of our ministry, and those maybe who we have less contact with, or maybe even in detached youth work. You know, that I think you're right, that's quite challenging. But I don't think I can underestimate the power of normalization and the power of naming. I know I mentioned it a couple of times, but it is critical because our brains say things like, you shouldn't feel this way, you're silly, you're daft, there are people worse off than you. But a couple of other things that this might be helpful. If I just share this slide here. I mean, there could be, so I'm just going to have to jump down a bit. Sorry, apologies. Just going to go up. I'll be there in a second when we get there. It's because I've got so many slides, you see. Anybody who knows me well knows I've got enough slides to, you know, train the world. Here we go. So this is just some ideas. I mean, sometimes it's important to know that young people can't always explain how they're feeling. So that can be a barrier because trying to explain feelings is quite a difficult thing. They don't always know why they're experiencing whatever it is. And so therefore they think I'm full of anxiety, but I don't know why. We've talked about embarrassment and also poor relationships with adults. And it might not necessarily be a poor relationship with us, but it could be that a young person's opened up before, could be with a GP or a social worker or another adult, and actually it's been dismissed. Or sometimes with young people, we can be quite dismissive with their challenges, like, oh, you know, there's plenty more fish in the sea, you'll be fine, or don't worry, you'll be all right once you get to school. And so they can end up thinking, well, adults don't really take me seriously. Of course, they could have been threatened. Or they may feel threatened about what's going on in their life, because of course their poor mental health could be down to problems at home, or maybe they're involved in county lines, or they're connected to some form of group or gang. They might actually be worried about what's going to happen next. So they think to themselves, if I tell so-and-so this, that's going to happen, or what will happen, particularly maybe around issues they might be aware, like maybe self-harm, or these slightly more issues where they may well have picked up about safeguarding. You know, they might not use that word, but they'll be aware through maybe education in schools and things that happens. They may feel like they failed. They might worry about getting into trouble or being taken over. So in other words, the moment you tell them, that's it, it's all out of their control, which is quite frightening for children, I think. They might not want to burden you. I've come across that many a time, you know. They might fear your reaction, which is about the safety thing. And they just might not know who to talk to or where to start. And the other thing to think about is there are barriers in communication about how we might feel. So, you know, we might struggle to go and make the approach or open ourselves up because we might feel like we don't know what on earth am I going to do if they mention this, or we can feel powerless, or in some situations, if young people express self-harm or suicidal thoughts, we might panic. We might struggle to understand. It can be hard to listen. We can sometimes, particularly in church life, be too close to the situation. That can be, and young people might fear that, and we might worry about that, particularly if the young person who's talking to us is our church leader, church leaders' kids or something. We might worry about that. We might not want to be involved, and you can see the rest. We could be too busy, hold our own judgments about things, and we just might not be available. And I think those are things that are always worth just bearing in mind about sort of the sorts of barriers that might just appear. And it isn't easy to know how to overcome them, but thinking about what are the barriers. If you ever do an exercise with young people where you do explore with them what some of the issues you're facing and who do you go to for help, get them to ask the question, who would you go to for what issue? And does it change depending on the issue? And get them to explore, how comes you wouldn't go and talk to a teacher or wouldn't come and talk to a youth worker? Because it's out of that conversation they may say, yeah, but this might happen, and you can help them understand what may or may not happen.
So helpful. Nate, can I just ask you a question about Zoom? Because a lot of, I don't know if this is the case for other people, but a lot of our youth stuff at the minute is happening on Zoom, and it has done for a long time, much longer than I'd hoped. But I think something that we're just struggling to do is, I think often our young people generally feel quite safe to talk when we're together, but it's a much different dynamic over Zoom, and I don't want that that conversation to be lost. Like, do you think there's anything that could help us if we are meeting online to keep having those kind of conversations and creating that space?
That's a really good question, because I'm not particularly doing a lot of work myself with young people on Zoom, but I hope they probably won't mind me saying, can get their permission in advance, but they're in the room next door. But I know in a very generic way, I know my own two daughters struggle with Zoom. I think a lot of young people do. And I think it's partly because they can see themselves. And I don't know, many of you probably got more expertise in this area. So it might feel a little bit more one way, maybe. But that's where I think the chat facility could be really useful, making sure when they go on the chat, they're not chatting to everyone. You know, they think they're just telling you about something that's happened, and they've just announced it to all 60 of the youth group or all 4, you know. So I don't know. I have an answer for that. I don't know whether anybody else is working online, but I think we can still use it as a space to, I mean, it's a good piece of information. And Youthscape produced some new research recently on how young people are feeling post-lockdown. And I suppose one of the things you could do is share that and ask your young people that, or maybe even do a poll. Use a poll on Zoom. Have you found it easier since you've been in lockdown? Harder? Do you find yourself more stressed, less stressed? So I think you could probably do it in quite a fun, interactive way. That could be another way, maybe, just to keep the conversation going. There's a new resource come out, and I'll share it at the end, by the Ugly Duckling Company, but Youthscape produced them as well, these conversation cards. You know, you could even have 10 cards up and get somebody to shout out a number, and you pick one and have a discussion about what's ever on the card. I mean, that could be another way, you know, just to ask questions about well-being. You know, what stresses you out most? You know, so I think it could be done. And I guess one of the other things, just to say, Anna, is one of the helpful things in talking about well-being, I find, is to move it into the third person. So I often say things like, rather than when I do a lesson, rather than say, what are the problems you experience? What are the problems young people your age experience and your peer group experience? What about your mates and friends? I find that sort of takes it out of the personal, although very often you'll soon realize they are talking about experiences that are similar to them at times as well. So I think that, I don't know if that helps you, but I think keep it light and soft touch, and maybe offer the opportunity, again, remind them at the end of the week, any of you still struggling, finding lockdown difficult, here's some help pages you can try on Young Mind or whatever, or if you want to message me and we can have a chat. So it's just keeping it, you know, bearing in mind not all young people are struggling. There are lots who are doing really well. So we don't want the wellbeing agenda to just be all about doom and gloom, but I think we have to be very practical. Signposty, I think, is really important, because a lot of young people say to me, everybody keeps talking about well-being, but nobody ever really tells us what to do about it, which I think is fascinating. So we've got to move beyond the, you know, yeah, I don't know whether that helps.
Yeah, no, that's hugely helpful, hugely helpful. Just to say, do carry on shouting up with questions, or put them in the chat if you want to, if you've got questions to pose to Nate. But Nate, I think we're going to spend a little bit more time thinking about some of those ancient paths that you've shared with us now. And I think we're going to go into breakout rooms to do that. But Nate, would you just share with us what you would like us to chat about when we're in those groups?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I might just do, Anna, very quickly, just because I forgot to share this one slide. Now, as I just put this up, I'll do that. this was a piece of research that was asked by the wonderful people at Young Minds. And they asked, it was questions young people wished that they had been asked. And it's a really great, I can get these slides to you after the session. But this could be another way of opening those conversations. You know, where is a place you feel safe? What were you worried about when you lie in bed asleep? How do you feel about growing up? Is there anyone who's upsetting you? How are you coping since your dad died? Is obviously, you ask that question to where that's relevant. You don't announce that to some random young person. That's the news. That's the way they find out. But what that question is about is specific. You know, how have you been coping since lockdown? It's a very focused question. Is there a lot of picking on people at your school? How do you feel about things changing? That's a great question. You know, transitions. That's another key thing about well-being, is when are there peaks and troughs in young people's lives, and transitions are critical. And what are you most dreading this week? I love that. Or what are you most looking forward to this week? That's a great Zoom question, isn't it? You know, or this time tomorrow. The Anglicans do something called This Time Tomorrow, where they get somebody up on a Sunday morning and say, this time tomorrow, what will you be doing? And people tell them and they pray into it. But I quite like that idea. And so you just get the idea. I think what the research showed is be specific, ask the questions. If they turn around and say nothing or don't know, that's fine. But at least we've asked them. I think we sometimes think with well-being that we need to tiptoe around the issue, but actually we can be direct. But yeah, the idea is what I thought just towards the end now is I think there are ancient paths in the Bible that could help young people to discover how to live well in the first place. So I'm writing a new resource in partnership with a charity that's launching later this year called 1010. And 1010 is a 10-part resource exploring positive psychology and spirituality, and what are the things that are good in life that we can learn to do to build our resilience and well-being. And I think there are lots of things littered in the Bible that help if young people were taught them and understood them and discovered ways of doing them, they could embed in their lives. And so I'd be interested to know what you think maybe some of the ancient paths are that have disappeared, the young people don't even know exist, that could be really good for young people to take hold of and flourish in. So that's the question, for you guys to see if you can come up with any, because I can add them to the course then.
That's great. So I'll split us into breakout rooms now, and it might be good to just share maybe the context that you're in, and then chat about some of those ancient paths that Nate's just shared. So you should hopefully on your screen just now have a little invite to a breakout room. So we'll maybe join back together in 5 or 10 minutes, maybe just in between. Maybe we could feedback just a couple of the things that we're chatting about in our groups. Nate's group, would you like to go first?
I don't know whether you want me to. You're going to hear enough from me. Ellie, do you fancy Angie giving it a quick? Would you rather I did it?
You did the notes.
Okay. Well done, Angie. Well done. Yeah, we just picked up the importance of communication and connecting with others, prayer, encouragement, which I love, encouragement and positive input, speaking words of encouragement, and the importance of worship. We felt were ancient paths that were there. That's a very quick summary, but that's
good. That's good. Anyone from our group want to share some highlights? Who was making notes? Who was a note maker in our group?
I wrote a couple of things down and not really many notes. So very briefly then, just 4 ideas we came up with. So gratitude and simplicity as one, just taking time to be. Appropriate vulnerability, giving young people the opportunity to say how it really is. Intentional storytelling. So they thinking around the young people, not just hearing Bible stories from the front at church in a big space, but sharing perhaps one-to-one. stories, and around food and eating. Jesus loved his food. He was always going to meals, having meals, sharing meals. So yeah, things about food and eating.
Thanks, Kath. Nate, one of the things that we just ended on chatting in our group was just maybe a question on how we help motivate our young people to do these things. I was just saying in my group, often, like if we've done like a term on the spiritual disciplines or something like that, we've kind of said, right, we're going to do this all together, and then you kind of come back the next week and they've like forgotten, or they just didn't do it or whatever. And I guess my question would be, how do we like help motivate young people to do some of these great things that we've just shared together?
Yeah, good. That's a very yeah. That's the difficult bit, isn't it? I think one of the things that I've begun to explore as I've been writing 1010 and exploring the whole arena of positive psychology and well-being is, I think that there are some things that you've mentioned, and they are critical. Things like gratitude and thankfulness and kindness and forgiveness and relationships, and realizing that your mind is not always telling you the truth, looking after your body, savoring and slowing down, which you mentioned, Kath, that idea of just, whoa, let's just take a rest and take a moment out. Managing those sorts of things in life are really critical to young people's well-being. What you and I would probably call character education. It exists massively at primary school, but when they get to secondary, most character education is normally lumped up into a mission statement under the school's, logo, and that's about as far as it gets. And so young people are not given the opportunity to really develop this character element of stuff that psychologists globally say will make you happier. So I'll give you an example. People who just write down 3 things every day that they're thankful for will see an improvement in their well-being. It's a globally recognized thing. It happens. People who have healthy relationships are happier. People who learn to forgive and let go of bitterness are happier. People who can savor and slow down and take notice and not keep rushing on are happier. And fundamentally, it's actually about how we help young people explore the different ways to be happy. That sounds like a funny question, happiness, because I know we don't always like it in the church. But actually, the most common asked question in life is, how can I be happy? That's what people want to know. They want to be happy. They want to be content. But the route they take is hedonic. And so one of the first things we can help young people to do to embrace new ideas is to help them explore to the degree at what they're doing, how is it actually helping them? So the problem with the hedonic approach to happiness, and it's not all sinful, by the way, hedonism, people automatically think, sex and that sort of stuff. But hedonic is really the pursuit of pleasure. But the brain is wired for new experiences. And if you keep doing something over and over and over again and you repeat it, your brain soon adapts. And when it adapts, you either need more of it or something different. The problem is we don't adapt. We just go for more and more and more. It's like social media is a good example. And scrolling, your brain just wants more, but it doesn't work. And so one of the things it can be a good starting point is to help them understand that that's what is happening to them. Nothing wrong with the hedonic side. It's just that it doesn't last. And once they begin to get a grip of that and they think, oh yeah, that doesn't always work, you can begin to help them understand that there's another way, which is called eudaimonia, which is things like kindness, forgiveness, and so on. I would say the premise of helping young people develop new disciplines in their life is difficult, hence why we need to work on it slowly and carefully, but it needs to be embedded well. So let's take thankfulness as an example. I think the first thing to do is to give young people a concept, introduce them to a concept, and introduce it quite lightly and quite creatively in a fun way. But, let's just talk about thankfulness for a minute and what you're thankful for and so on. But then it's useful to understand the gap. So I call it mind the gap. What's unthankfulness like? What does it feel like? Or unforgiveness. You could do unforgiveness is a good one. What does unforgiveness feel like? Unkindness. What are they like? What does it feel like to be treated badly? What does it feel like when a relationship goes wrong? What does it feel like not to have purpose or feel like you don't have any real meaning? So helping them to understand the gap is useful, because that's part of the motivation to think, I need this to be different. Then explore the topic and get them to talk about it, but do it in a way that's less teachy and more about exploring a concept. So, you know, and once you've done that, and give them practical tools and ideas they can use to explore it, and do that in the session rather than just teaching something to do outside the session. Actually embody it in the session, in your practice. So like you could have a kindness month, for instance, if you're exploring the discipline of kindness, and do an anti-bullying campaign or an anti-racism campaign, and you could do lots of things to show kindness. Every week you give the young people a little gift when they come in, and, you know, just things that embody it. And then help them to think about the benefits. So the next stage is to ask, what are the benefits? So there are psychological benefits to living well. What are they? And if you can, get them to hear, you know, on the resource I'm working on, you'll be able to listen to experts, but it could be that you've got a GP in your church or somebody who you could talk about the benefits, and then give them space to experiment, go away and experiment, and give them loads of ideas, get them to contribute to ideas. I'm not saying it's easy, but it very much is launch the concept, what's the gap, give it a go, and then give them space to question, discuss, and have a go themselves. But I think the best way to do it then is to model that. So the destigmatization thing earlier on is just to model it all the time, you know, to model it all the time. And I think once you model it and embed it, it becomes a habit. But the only problem with eudaimonia over hedonic is hedonic happiness is pretty instant. Doesn't last, but it's instant. Eudaimonia is, you don't do eudaimonia to become happy. You do it because it's good, but because it's good, it makes you happier. Does that sort of make sense? And that's actually quite challenging. So I think I would say to you, it's actually quite difficult. That's the answer, but it's worth doing it. And the resource for writing 1010 is designed as a suite of resources. You could explore the 10 leading things that improve well-being over a year if you wanted to. You could do it in 10 weeks. But what I love about them is positive psychology. It's secular, but every single one of them is found in the Bible. And even the people who write positive psychology say, do you know what? Most of this is found in the virtue of faith. And forgiveness is a powerful one, isn't it? As I say, kindness, positive relationships, they're all in the Bible. Connecting to others, communicating, taking time out, story, it's all there. And I think we have to be really intentional about helping young people understand there is potentially a different way to live. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's quite an uphill climb, actually, because everything in society is doing it differently.
Yeah.
And a lot of this will be new, and it's not instant, which young people is potentially problematic, isn't it? Because we all want it straight away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's about realization. For me, it's about just giving them space to question and say, yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. Or so it's about space to have to get some thinking going. Yeah. I don't know whether that's helpful or whether that's raised more questions than answers.
No, that is really helpful. And you've mentioned 1010 already. Are there any other like good resources that you've come across, Nate, to kind of help us explore this a bit further?
If you want to talk about well-being in general, Youthscape have some really good stuff, some great resources from Youthscape, you know, on lots of different topics. They've got a new website called Headstrong, which is really good. There are lots of resources out there that deal with well-being. What I love, I don't know but I don't know of many that deal with how to live life well in terms of coming at it from the position of positive psychology. There will be lots of educational resources that exist within schools, but not many. I haven't come across many. I don't know whether Amy you have, but there aren't many off-the-shelf resources that explore how to live well, coming at it from the positive angle. So most of our mental health care is crisis orientated. You probably noticed that. It's all about what happens when it goes wrong. What we need to do is step back and start getting people supported before then. But I don't know of many positive psychology resources, but there are articles and things out there. But Youthscape's a good place for general well-being resources. And Young Minds is a great website if you want specific information about well-being, and a great place to signpost young people to as well. I've got lots of lists of resources on my website, actually. you want me to bring that up for you quickly before we come to the end?
Yeah.
You should know that. Just gonna... And then if anybody wants to email me, I'll sorry, in front of you got my training PowerPoint, and there we go. Oops, oh, it's taking you straight to the one. I was just sorry. Me and Zoom. I'm only just catching up with all this exciting technology. There we go. Oh, it's taking it anyway. So it's every time I share it, it takes you to the end. But it's, yeah, so it's nathan.jones@talkthrough.org.uk. You can message me through the platform of the conference anyway, or talkthrough.org.uk. And from there, you can get the links to, you can email me. I mean, if you want to email me, I will email you a couple of the slides we did today, and I will email you the link to the 1010 resource, and you know, and things like Young Minds and places like that. That might be helpful. And as I say, Youthscape, but most of you may well be aware of Youthscape.
That's great.
You mentioned earlier about the importance of teaching optimism in the junior years. Is there a resource that I'd like to get some more information on that?
The answer to the question is no. I don't know of one, but I will take a look. I mean, I say that there are psychology websites, and yes, I will dig something out for you if you like, Kath.
Amazing, thank you.
There is. I'm just trying to think of the name of the website. It'll come to me. I think it's called. It's not Psychology Today. It's another one, and they have lots. They're a great newsletter. Actually, they send you to lots of sample worksheets. But optimism, a lot of optimistic teaching is not about look on the bright side, in the sense of just positive thinking. It's actually about challenging thinking. So it's actually about helping young people to, they get a thought, not necessarily accept that that thought is true. It might be real, but it might not be true. Example might be, I'm useless at maths, or I'm going to fail that exam. Or that always happens to me. You probably heard of catastrophizing and all the different types of thinking. Optimism is about helping young people to see that actually there's potentially a way through. But yes, I'll have a look at some specific resources for you. Some of it does appear in 1010. There's a whole session on the mind, about how we challenge the mind. It's the idea, isn't it, that the glass actually is always full, even if it's half water, half air. It's always full. But it's not positive thinking. People think optimism is just positive thinking. If it's raining, it's raining. But optimism would say, but with the right support, it will probably be sunny soon. So it's not about looking on the bright side, as I said. It is very much about teaching young people to challenge and manage their thoughts, and realizing where I am now might not be where I am tomorrow. And just because I feel this now, or even feel it, that might not be true. You know, and if I go and talk to someone, I can get help. It's about challenging that critical thinking that young people sometimes, well, all of us actually struggle with. Yeah.
Thank you, that's helpful.
I'll dig something out for you, Kath, and see if there's some. Are you thinking like primary end or?
Yes, yeah.
There are actually. There's a lot more resources on this stuff for primary end because it's such a big deal in primary schools.
Yeah.
Positive education. Yeah.
Well, Nate, I'm aware of the time that we've got to. I feel like this hour together has completely flown by. So I guess we've kind of come to the end of our time together for now. I was just thinking, like, what a great opportunity it is to have the Meeting Hub on the Fresh Streams platform, so we can kind of continue these conversations in another way if we want to. And Nate, you're around for us to badge you with more questions, aren't you, if we wanted to. But as I said at the beginning as well, because we've recorded this session, it means that you'll be able to come back to it again, or I guess share it with other people if you know other people who would benefit from seeing it. But basically, Nate, thank you so much for sharing with us this afternoon. It's been so helpful. I found it hugely helpful for my work with the youth at church and in school. So we're really grateful for your time. But just before we go, I wondered if you would pray for us, Nate.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Let me pray for you in your context. Father, thank you for our time together. Lord, we know that sometimes life's difficulties just seem to flood over us and overwhelm us. But Lord, we also know that you have created ways to live that are ways to live well. And Father, not only do we need to discover them and embrace them, but we need to help young people discover ancient paths of how to live well. And Father, would you enable that to happen? I pray for each person here in this meeting today, Lord. I pray you bless them. I pray you keep them, that you would turn your face to shine upon them, that you grant them peace and blessing in their ministry, in their conversations. Encourage them, Lord, that just by their very presence, they are pathways of well-being to young people as they provide security and friendship and relationship and care and attention. And Lord, let us never forget just how important it is to be noticed by somebody. So I just pray your blessing on them, Lord, as they leave this place and space. And Lord, would you reveal to us over these next few days more and more of your ancient paths, and may we with all willingness walk in them. Amen.